The most distant records speak of a species already old when the first complex ecologies were stabilizing on a wide scatter of young worlds. Their presence is detected less by name than by pattern, where there are symmetrical megaliths aligned to stellar nodes, where continental plates show engineered restraint against catastrophic drift, where seasonal cycles hold to an unusually precise modulation. Despite chaotic local inputs, there is the signature of a designer that preferred living systems tuned like instruments. These signs recur on worlds that never shared natural history, and the correlation points back to a single, ancient program of intervention. In later ages, that program is attributed to the Old Ones, a term applied by descendants and rivals, never by the architects themselves. The label persists because no other name is anchored to evidence with the same regularity. Their earliest purpose is reconstructed from the outcomes they left in their wake. They did not populate blank slates indiscriminately. They selected biomes where life could take hold, accelerated diversification when ecological niches were underfilled, and damped self-destructive spirals when evolution moved towards sterile extremes. They preferred complexity that could support cognition, and cognition that could eventually sustain controlled interaction with the Imperium. Across thousands of biospheres, the same gestures repeat. Neural structures trend toward architectures that favor symbolic language, cooperative planning, and stable long-horizon memory. Faunal webs expand around keystone herbivores, protected from extinction shocks by engineered refugia. Predators receive constraints on reproductive rhythms that prevent collapse of prey populations. The intention looks neither sentimental nor reckless. It is dispassionate, iterative, and system-level in scope. That program implies an origin timeline far earlier than the first upright thinkers among the Aeldari, and far earlier than any archaeological trace of settled human cultures. The Old Ones were present when the galaxy's stellar distribution still contained many bright, short-lived stars unshielded by dense dust lanes, and when warp turbulence was less crowded by the emotional noise of modern civilizations. Their choice to manipulate life rather than fabricate machine polities suggests a conclusion about the environment into which they grew. They assessed the Imperium as an unavoidable feature of existence, rather than a hazard to be ignored. If thought and emotion would inevitably feed the warp, then the only sustainable strategy was to teach minds to interface with it intentionally, and to build extrinsic systems, like the Webway, that could use its geometry without submitting to its volatility. Those two tracks, biological and infrastructural, define their early purpose. Accounts of their appearance vary because the best witnesses were not peers but pupils, subjects or enemies, and each group projected its own assumptions. Some Aeldari myth cycles, filtered through later translations, describe teacher beings with long, flat skulls, horizontally set eyes, and a stillness that prompted comparison to cold-blooded creatures observed on the student's cradle world. Other xenos records recovered from pre-imperial archives refer to amphibian-coded silhouettes with flexible joints, wide mouths, and cranial crests that may have been cartilage sheaths over sensory arrays. A minority of mechanistic reconstructions argue for a tall, slender morphology with reduced body hair, smooth integument, and a posture optimized for low-energy movement in high-humidity environments. No complete skeleton is available for definitive measurement. There are conflicting scale references in ancient murals that place their stature as low as one adult human's chest and as high as twice a human's standing height. The weight estimates that follow from these images are equally uncertain. It is believed that the range from less than 100 kilograms to more than 300 kilograms describes the extremes, but this remains unconfirmed. Despite physical ambiguity, behavioral traits emerge with more consistency when multiple sources are compared. The Old Ones communicated across distance without reliance on acoustic channels, and the latency in that communication appears to have been negligible over planetary horizons. That suggests disciplined telepathy, or a technology so mature that it mimicked innate thought-to-thought exchange. Their decision-making moved along timelines measured in millennia, but their tactical adjustments within those plans were agile. They were not static gods. They were scientists who revised hypotheses in the presence of contradictory data. They typically avoided direct rulership over client species and instead inserted teachers, caretakers, and wardens who modelled desired behaviours and withdrew when those behaviours stabilised. When those interventions failed, they replaced selection with design. Design reached into genomes and out through social frameworks. The Aeldari were shaped to be precise instruments for the Imperium. Their neurochemistry correlates with high baseline sensitivity to warp currents and with a capacity for fine control that few later species matched at comparable developmental stages. Where the Aeldari genome shows elegant economy, the project that produced the Krork favoured redundancy and resilience. The Krork cellular systems tolerate injury, starvation, and radiation to degrees that would annihilate delicate psyches. Their group cognition layers learning onto quasi-instinctive technical competence, allowing robust manufacture and maintenance of tools that they do not fully conceptualize. Both species were configured to stabilize themselves without continuous supervision. One would modulate the warp with discipline, the other would blunt and break material threats that resisted modulation. The Old Ones did not only shape minds and bodies, they also altered the physical stage on which those minds and bodies acted. In strata older than any settled human city, there are tunnels whose inner surfaces carry the residue of controlled phase shift and temperature hold at near absolute zero. These artifacts are gateways into sealed corridors outside real space, described by later civilizations as the Webway. The Old Ones' early purpose is legible within this network. They built roads that did not cross hostile seas but bypassed them. They achieved continuity between distant star systems without surrendering passengers to the storms of the Imperium. The network is impersonal. It does not encode a theology. It encodes a preference for safety, predictability, and the long maintenance cycle required to keep a civilizational project coherent after the founders depart. Departure appears to have been a design requirement from the beginning. A civilization that intends to rule indefinitely builds strongly marked centers of authority, public rituals of obedience, and redundant coercive instruments. The Old Ones ceded none of these as defaults. Their artifacts are either invisible in daily life or so integrated into local ecologies that later populations mistake them for natural features. This looks like planned obsolescence of governance rather than the decline of capacity. The goal and purpose read as mentorship at galactic scale. When biological and infrastructural resilience sufficed, the mentors could reduce contact to minimal calibration and turn attention to new theatres. The limitation of this approach is exposed by the reaction of other actors who did not share the same theory of the Imperium. The Necrontyr arose in a context of short, painful lives under an unshielded star and cultivated a hostility to the cosmos that the Old Ones' projects did not resolve. Where the Old Ones invested in the warp as a medium that could be learned, the Necrontyr, and later their undying successors, sought to negate it, to cancel its fluctuations, and to sever its coupling to sentient life. This dispute over the nature of reality predates open conflict, but shapes the Old Ones' early purpose by negative definition. To counter a vision of existence without souls, they committed more deeply to creating minds that could perceive and shape the currents that the Necrontyr hated. Within that framework, the Old Ones accepted costs that a more self-protective civilization might have rejected. Uplifted species reach adolescence with uneven judgment. Psychers discover leverage before they understand responsibility. Societies with newly extended lifespans make different errors than short-lived ones. The Old Ones' response was not to halt uplift, but to monitor failure states and introduce governors. In some cases, they embedded caretaker clades believed to be derived from their own biology or from co-evolved collaborators. In other cases, they placed automated systems that simulated oversight. When the number of client species grew beyond direct management, they accelerated the build-out of the Webway to prevent a maintenance deficit from crashing the entire portfolio. Their biology, insofar as any consensus description can be trusted, reflects long operating lives and slow, deliberate growth. it is believed that juveniles underwent extended development with multiple phases responsive to environmental input, not unlike certain amphibians that delay metamorphosis until precise seasonal signals are received. If true, this would explain why the same species could be depicted as small, soft-bodied scholars in one account and as tall, crested administrators in another, without requiring different taxa. A developmental program with significant plasticity would also align with their interest in adapting themselves for stewardship in diverse climates and gravities. None of these inferences can be proven with surviving tissue. The absence of verified remains may result from deliberate erasure, efficient recycling practices, exposure to warp predators that consume more than flesh, or simple archaeological loss over spans measured in tens of millions of years. In cognition, they appear to have combined high bandwidth empathy with strict compartmentalization. They connected to student minds, sifted symbolic frameworks, and supplied corrective insights without collapsing the student's identity into their own. At the same time, they maintained secrecy around their strategic aims, which suggests internal partitioning of knowledge and authority. The few surviving schematics consistent with their tools show clean interfaces that prevent accidental activation and ensure that complex operations complete or fail safely. Such design tells a story about the designers. They expected users to make mistakes. They prevented one mistake from compounding into many. They accepted that future operators would not share the engineer's full understanding, but would still need to succeed. The goals underlying the entire enterprise can be expressed plainly. The Old Ones wanted a galaxy where thinking species could travel without being shredded by the Imperium, where the warp's tides were calm enough to allow culture to persist, and where predatory forces that fed on despair, rage, and excess could be starved through disciplined habit rather than constant war. They did not seek to suppress emotion, because emotion is the warp's medium, but to curate its expression through education and institutional design. Their approach to conflict was to minimize it by aligning incentives and capacities, and when conflict proved unavoidable, to field proxies adapted to the threat at hand. The Krork exist because some enemies do not respond to reason, and some situations cannot be de-escalated. The Aeldari exist because some problems are solved by precision, foresight, and direct engagement with the Imperium's texture. The Old Ones' attitude toward time is inseparable from their purpose. They work toward outcomes that they did not plan to witness. They accepted that projects might cross gaps of silence between epochs. They built archives that were not sermons but field manuals, and they cached those manuals in places where survivors of cataclysm would naturally gather. The archaeological record shows instructions that assume loss and provide recovery pathways. A society that leaves behind resilient help for strangers, written in concepts rather than in parochial languages, is one that understood civilizational death as a parameter, not an unthinkable exception. In this too, the Old Ones were gardeners. They pruned, they grafted, and they accepted that seasons include winter. When myth intrudes on this account, it does so because the Old Ones allow themselves to be seen as benefactors by those who needed a frame for gratitude. In Aeldari cultural memory, shadowed by later tragedy, there are quiet tales of patient tutors who taught names for stars and showed how to feel the gentle motions of the warp without being dragged by them. In Orkoid folk patterning, which is difficult to parse because it stores knowledge in behaviour rather than in explicit narrative, there are reflexes that activate when the foe presents certain signatures of strength or deception, implying initial conditioning. In neither case do the Old Ones demand worship. They cultivate capability. Where later pantheons demand sacrifice and fear, the Old Ones demand practice. This distinction marks the boundary between religion and instruction in the way their pupils remembered them. Unsurprisingly, such a program created enemies beyond the Necrontyr. Entities within the Imperium that depended on uncontrolled emotional surges yielded less return when confronted by societies trained to regulate excess. Predatory civilizations in real space lost easy prey when travel became safer for the weak. Some client species interpreted the withdrawal of their tutors as abandonment and tried to reverse the trend by installing rulers who mimicked the Old One's authority without understanding its limits. The Old Ones appear to have anticipated these reversals and built processes that could absorb them. They also appear to have underestimated the total pressure that a coalition of resentments could exert once it coalesced. Even in success, the Old Ones expressed restraint. They did not optimize for maximum psychic amplitude or maximum military dominance. They targeted sufficiency and stability. The Webway does not replace every function of warp travel. It replaces the parts that cause the most harm. Aeldari psionics do not burn brightest at all times. They are capable of fine work when trained and dangerous when neglected. Krork society does not cultivate philosophy. It cultivates reliable aggression aimed at external foes. Each design trades peak performance for survivability under noise and error. Measured against the galaxy's later history, the restraint looks prescient. Measured against the ferocity of their eventual wars, some will argue that they should have pushed harder earlier. That argument cannot be resolved here. The relevant point is that restraint was not an accident. It was policy. If their biology can be inferred from their outcomes, then the Old Ones were patient, precise, and disinclined to theatrics. They valued feedback loops that corrected error without shaming the operator. They used tools that explained themselves to attentive users and remained opaque to the careless. If they bore scars, they did not exhibit them to invite sympathy. Where later empires memorialize victories and lineage, the Old Ones preferred not to be seen at all. The invisibility of the Maker lets the made stand on its own. That, more than any particular anatomical feature, defines their character as it can be reconstructed from fragments. As the prelude to open conflict closes, their early purpose stands clarified. They built minds to understand the warp rather than fear it. They built routes to cross the galaxy without feeding the worst of it. They built cultures that could learn, heal, and continue without them. They accepted that some of those cultures would fail, and they supplied tools for recovery. They treated time not as an enemy but as a partner. They planted and walked on, trusting that design, once embedded in living systems, would hold shape through drought and storm. Whether that trust was justified will be evaluated in later parts of this chapter, when their creations are measured against the pressures they were built to endure. Biological specifics remain open, and that openness is itself a datum. A species that can hide its dead, edit its traces, or dissolve its marker molecules before scavengers reach them is a species that knew it would be studied by enemies. The absence of residue does not prove non-existence, it proves caution and competence. The little that is glimpsed, smooth integument resistant to desiccation, sensory crests able to detect fine electromagnetic changes, pupils adaptive to abrupt brightness shifts, limb proportions that support efficient motion in water and on land, forms a silhouette consistent with a lineage comfortable at the edge of multiple environments. That is the silhouette of a generalist that chose to become a specialist in stewardship. Their goal and purpose in sum were not to conquer, convert, or consume. They intended to create conditions in which many forms of life could persist with dignity and agency, to provide instruments that stabilized a turbulent universe, and to do so with a minimum of reliance on the personalities of the founders. They were ancient at the start of the story and mature enough to plan for their own irrelevance. The crisis that follows will test that maturity. The record of their origins closes not with a proclamation, but with quiet systems that still work long after the voice of their makers has faded, which is as close to a signature as they allowed themselves. The account of Aeldari psychic precision as a designed trait, the Krork as a resilient proxy war species, and the Old One's dual track of biological and infrastructural solutions relies on cross-reading Aeldari Codex psychic rules and lore, Orc cultural and biological notes, and Necron Codex passages that frame Old One intentions by contrast with Necrontyr goals. The technology of the Old Ones is inferred rather than catalogued, since intact examples are scarce, and most known artifacts remain partially functional yet incomprehensible. What distinguishes their tools from those of later species is not sheer destructive capacity, but the seamless fusion of biological and material design. Many devices attributed to them display organic curvature. surfaces that resist corrosion without visible coatings, and interfaces that adjust themselves to the physiology of the user. It is believed that they preferred designs in which the operator's thought or intent was enough to activate core functions, bypassing intermediary controls. That preference is consistent with their mastery of psychic disciplines and their reliance on uplifted client species trained to focus minds with clarity. The distinction between gear, tool, and vehicle becomes blurred in their system, because each object was engineered to act as an extension of the operator's body and mind. The Webway is the clearest surviving infrastructure example. Its portals are not fixed mechanisms in the conventional sense. They are adaptive thresholds whose apertures shift in size and orientation to accommodate the user. The walls of the passage are smooth to touch, resistant to invasive force, and lined with structures that damp psychic turbulence. They represent a hybrid of real space engineering and warp shaping. A portal is both a machine and an organism, an artifact that sustains itself across eons with minimal external input. Attempts by later species to maintain or replicate this network demonstrate how much the Old Ones integrated biological principles into their technology. Aeldari maintenance depends on rituals that align thought with residual control matrices, while Necron intrusions require brute force to pin the system open. Neither successor can reproduce the self-repair and stability that marked the original design. Personal equipment from the Old Ones period is more difficult to characterize. Descriptions in secondary accounts mention rods that projected fields strong enough to deflect high-energy weaponry, and orbs that unfolded into sensor arrays capable of mapping entire planetary biomes. Weapons attributed to them often employed manipulation of natural forces at levels that seem disproportionate to their intended use. One recovered fragment is said to have generated controlled gravitational anomalies, pinning adversaries to the ground or flinging them across distances. Another account describes crystalline blades that could phase through armor by adjusting vibrational frequency. These descriptions may exaggerate or distort, but they align with the principle that Old One technology did not require brute mass. They favored precision and multi-purpose functions, designing tools that could disable, heal, or build as easily as they could destroy. Vehicles, insofar as they existed in a recognizable form, appear to have been versatile atmospheric and orbital craft. Surviving myths from client species describe vessels that moved silently, hovering without exhaust trails, and accelerating with abrupt precision unmatched by later propulsion systems. Some sources suggest that these craft used anti-gravity fields powered directly by warp resonance, allowing for motion unhindered by fuel depletion or mechanical stress. The hulls are said to have been smooth and self-repairing, shifting in color or transparency according to environmental need. Where most later civilizations divide transport, war machines, and habitat modules, the Old Ones seem to have preferred modular platforms capable of all three functions. A ship could serve as a sanctuary, a laboratory, or a weapon depending on context, with internal systems adjusting fluidly to the needs of its crew. The way the Old Ones distributed technology within their society illuminates their values. Tools were not monopolized by an elite but provided broadly to uplifted clients, though the complexity of operation varied. They prioritized education over control, suggesting confidence in their designs and in the long-term discipline of their students. In cases where misuse was possible, they embedded safety mechanisms that reduced catastrophic outcomes. This points to a cultural principle. Technology was not for domination, but for stewardship. The tools extended the operator's natural abilities, amplified intention, and encouraged learning. A culture oriented around such devices would value curiosity, patience, and responsibility. Social structure among the Old Ones remains opaque, but inferences can be made from how they interacted with others. They operated less as a centralized empire and more as a distributed council of stewards. There is no evidence of a single monarch or imperial capital. Instead, records suggest clusters of decision-makers who coordinated across the galaxy, each responsible for a sphere of client species and ecological projects. Leadership may have been rotational or situational, with authority delegated according to expertise. A scholar specializing in warp harmonics would oversee the construction of Webway nodes, while a geneticist would direct the uplift of a particular species. Hierarchy was therefore flexible, grounded in knowledge rather than inheritance or conquest. This decentralized model extended to values. The Old Ones are consistently described as patient, detached, and pragmatic. They did not intervene for glory or conquest, but to shape conditions for long-term stability. They valued continuity over spectacle, which explains their tendency to conceal themselves in myths rather than demand open reverence. Knowledge, balance, and endurance were their guiding ideals. Their restraint in warfare until the Necrontyr conflict supports this view. Violence was a last resort, enacted through proxies when diplomacy and ecological adjustment failed. Civilian and military roles within their society appear less distinct than in later empires. Because their tools were adaptive and their projects long in scope, the boundary between civilian stewardship and military action blurred. A caretaker species designed to tend ecosystems could be weaponized simply by redirecting its focus against invaders. An engineer maintaining the Webway was also defending it, since sabotage would endanger entire civilizations. Among the Old Ones themselves, roles likely shifted according to necessity. A single individual might serve as teacher, scientist, and strategist in different contexts with tools enabling this versatility. The absence of rigid castes in their records reinforces the interpretation that they preferred flexibility and competence to specialization. When direct military intervention was unavoidable, the Old Ones deployed constructs and engineered auxiliaries, rather than massed armies of their own kind. The Krork, shaped for resilience and aggression, exemplify this reliance on proxies. They served as shock troops capable of meeting Necrontyr advances head-on, absorbing losses that the Old Ones themselves could not afford. At the same time, more subtle creations like the Yokero, engineers with instinctive mastery of technology, handled adaptive responses at smaller scales. In this model, the Old Ones occupied the role of coordinators rather than frontline warriors. Their military power was real, but it flowed through others, consistent with their cultural pattern of mentorship. Civilian life, insofar as it can be reconstructed, revolved around observation, teaching, and experimentation. They appear to have valued environments as laboratories and sanctuaries, rather than as mere resource pools. Worlds seeded with new life were monitored not for extraction but for developmental milestones. The Old Ones civilians may have spent lifetimes studying a single biome, adjusting conditions with careful interventions, and preparing client species for self-sufficiency. That patience distinguishes them from resource-driven empires, and it also explains why so little material culture survives. They did not clutter their environment with excess artifacts. Their tools were efficient, durable, and often integrated into natural settings to the point of invisibility. The blending of civilian and military functions extended into ethics. Where most societies build separate codes for peace and war, the Old Ones followed a unified ethic of stewardship. Whether nurturing or defending, the core value was preservation of balance. Even their war machines embodied this principle. Rather than annihilating enemies indiscriminately, their weapons targeted specific disruptions. A gravitational weapon could pin combatants without destroying surrounding ecosystems. A psychic amplifier could calm panic rather than incinerate minds. These choices reveal an ethical orientation that sought minimal disruption even in violence. In leadership style, the Old Ones emphasized consensus and adaptability. They avoided rigid authority structures that could collapse under the weight of millennia. Instead, their leaders acted as facilitators, mediating between conflicting needs of species, ecologies, and projects. This suggests a society trained to accept collective decision-making, valuing debate and evidence over command by decree. Such values would align naturally with a technological base designed to be safe, multi-purpose, and user-adaptive. Taken together, their technology and social organization form a coherent pattern. The Old Ones built tools that amplified thought, societies that distributed responsibility, and militaries that relied on creations tailored for specific threats. Their values prioritized stability, restraint, and long-term survival. They did not glorify war but accepted its necessity when the galaxy resisted their design. Civilians and military agents shared overlapping roles, united by the ethic of stewardship. In this balance between technology and culture, the Old Ones distinguished themselves as architects rather than conquerors, gardeners at scale rather than rulers of an empire. The next phase of their history will test whether these structures were sufficient when confronted with enemies who rejected their values entirely. But in their prime, the Old Ones exemplified a civilization where technology and society were inseparable, and where the purpose of power was not to dominate but to preserve. The legends that survive concerning the Old Ones speak less of individuals and more of a collective presence so advanced that the idea of singular rulers or generals feels primitive by comparison. Unlike the younger species who catalogue every battle and every leader's name for posterity, the Old Ones left behind only traces in the forms of their works, their genetic legacies, and the scars of the wars they unleashed across the stars. To identify famous leaders among them is therefore an exercise of piecing together disparate accounts recorded by the Aeldari, the Orcs, and even the fragmentary data caches of the Necrons, each shaped by bias and cultural perspective. Yet despite the absence of names or clear titles, several archetypes emerge, figures whose influence reverberates across millennia, not as personalities but as embodiments of the Old One's vast power. The first of these archetypes is the Shaper and Teacher, a role most associated with their interventions in creating and uplifting species. These were not military leaders in the traditional sense, but genetic architects who set entire civilizations upon predetermined paths. They are remembered in Aeldari myth as the distant progenitors of their psychic gifts, and in Orc memory as the legendary Brain Boys, guiding presences whose teachings were baked into instinct and instinctive technology. To the Necrontyr, these figures were not seen as benevolent but as meddling overlords, whose interventions only deepened their resentment of mortal frailty, in contrast to the Old Ones' seeming immortality. A second archetype is the Warden and Strategist, a figure tied to the Great War in Heaven. These leaders directed the deployment of species, the manipulation of warp currents, and the distribution of weapons that could reshape entire systems. They are remembered indirectly through the massive scale of the conflicts they orchestrated, wars where entire stellar regions became testing grounds for biological weapons and psychic constructs. Though no names survive, the idea that the Old Ones possessed individuals who embodied military command cannot be dismissed, for even a race as advanced as theirs required structures of decision-making in times of crisis. The third archetype is the Guardian of Knowledge, perhaps a caste or simply a functional division among their kind. These figures safeguarded the lore of their people, encoded their understanding of the warp, and carried out the rituals of preservation that ensured their teachings endured in fragmented form across successor races. It is through these guardians that shards of Old One wisdom may have bled into the crone worlds of the Aeldari, or even into the instinctive knowledge woven into the DNA of the Krork. Though the names of these figures are forever lost, the legacies of the machines and weapons they created endure. The Old Ones were the architects of technology so advanced that much of it seems indistinguishable from the warp itself. Some myths suggest they seeded the earliest Webway structures, though whether they built the first strands or simply refined a pre-existing natural phenomenon remains debated. The Webway stands as a living monument to their engineering, a labyrinth of hidden pathways immune to the worst tides of the warp, a construct that even the Aeldari in their height could not fully master. Among their more directly martial works are the bioengineered armies crafted during the War in Heaven. The most enduring of these were the Krork, who in the long ages since have degenerated into the Orcs of the present. Though diminished, their genetic robustness and instinctive technological tendencies still speak of their original design. The Krork were intended as shock troops, immune to despair, self-repairing through fungal propagation, and guided by latent psychic fields that stabilized their war machines. In the age of the Old Ones, they represented one of the greatest weapons a civilization could wield, a species as much a tool as an army. Other war constructs are hinted at in fragmentary Aeldari records, describing entities that blurred the line between living being and warp-spawned weapon. These may have included psycho-reactive engines, machines fueled by collective thought and directed through psychic harmonization. Some fragments suggest that entire fleets of such vessels existed, their operation requiring not physical crews but resonance with the will of the Old Ones themselves. To the Necrons, these were abominations, unnatural unions of material and immaterial realms, yet to the Old Ones they were simply one extension of their mastery over both planes. The behavioural tendencies of the Old Ones are perhaps most visible not in direct records, but in the echoes of their works and the species they shaped. They were a species defined by interventionist instincts, rarely content to leave the galaxy to its natural course. Their behavioural pattern reveals a guiding principle: to elevate, manipulate, and weaponize life according to their strategic needs. This is most clearly seen in their genetic experiments, where species were not merely uplifted for survival, but crafted as tools to serve in wider conflicts. The Aeldari were sculpted for psychic sensitivity, the Krork for physical resilience and instinctive war, and countless minor races shaped to fill niches of defense, communication, or resource exploitation. These instincts were underpinned by a philosophy of long-term planning. The Old Ones did not act in the immediacy of mortal concerns, but in arcs of time spanning millions of years. Their decision-making suggests a detachment from the urgency of survival, replaced instead by the drive to shape the galaxy into a controlled, stable structure under their indirect guidance. Whether this was rooted in benevolence, arrogance, or simple pragmatism remains impossible to determine, yet the behavioural evidence suggests a tendency toward viewing other species not as equals but as instruments. Rituals and ethics among the Old Ones are obscured by the lack of surviving cultural detail, yet speculation can be drawn from the structured nature of their works. Their ethics appear rooted in utilitarian calculation, judging actions by their broader consequences rather than their immediate morality. In their design of the Krork, for example, they demonstrated no hesitation in creating a species defined by endless violence, so long as that violence served the purpose of defeating the Necrons. Likewise, in their genetic shaping of the Aeldari, they elevated a species whose psychic brilliance would later draw the attention of predatory warp entities, a risk that suggests either disregard for collateral consequences or a confidence that such dangers could be contained. Their rituals, if they can be so described, likely centered upon the harnessing of the warp. The Old Ones' mastery of immaterial energy implies that they engaged in structured practices to channel and refine it, rituals that may have served both scientific and spiritual purposes. Fragments of Aeldari myth that describe the first teachers offering instruction in the shaping of psychic energy hint at ceremonial contexts where knowledge was transmitted through guided experience, not dispassionate instruction. Such practices may have constituted the core of Old One ritual, a blending of science, spirituality, and pedagogy. The internal structure of their species remains one of the greatest mysteries. Some accounts suggest the presence of caste divisions, with specific groups dedicated to genetic manipulation, warp mastery, or martial command. The Aeldari myths that depict the Old Ones as teachers of particular disciplines support the idea of specialization. If this interpretation is correct, the Old Ones may have functioned less as a unified people and more as a federation of roles, each group carrying responsibility for one aspect of their civilization's vast projects. It is equally possible that their divisions were not rigid castes but philosophical alignments, with groups defining themselves according to their interpretation of how best to wield their power. One group may have emphasized genetic manipulation, while another focused on warp engineering, and a third on strategic oversight of galactic order. These alignments may have created internal tensions, disagreements over how best to respond to the Necrontyr, or how far to extend intervention into the lives of lesser species. Though speculation, this would explain why some Old One works emphasize psychic mastery, while others emphasize genetic or technological solutions, perhaps the result of competing schools of thought. Whatever their internal organization, their values were clear: mastery, intervention, and the shaping of destiny on a galactic scale. They placed themselves as custodians of the material and immaterial realms, guiding the fates of lesser species according to designs that transcended mortal comprehension. Their ethics permitted the creation of living weapons, their rituals maintained their communion with the warp, and their structures ensured that knowledge, once gained, was never lost. In this way, the Old Ones emerged not as a monolithic culture, but as a civilization of vast complexity, united by shared instincts yet divided by roles and perspectives. Their leaders were not personalities to be remembered by name, but archetypes, embodiments of roles so enduring that they continue to echo through the myths of the species they shaped. Their machines were not engines of steel and fire, but living constructs of gene code and warp resonance, weapons that endured even as their creators vanished. Their rituals were not prayers, but the disciplined harnessing of the warp, practices that blurred the line between science and faith. And their divisions were not of petty politics, but of philosophy, the disagreements of a species that sought to shape the galaxy itself. What remains of them is scattered. Myths in Aeldari song, instincts in orc biology, scars in Necron memory, and faint traces in the labyrinthine pathways of the Webway. Yet through these fragments, the outlines of their nature emerge. They were the first to claim stewardship over the galaxy, and though they are gone, their influence has never truly vanished. The Imperium of Man has always struggled with the ghosts of its past. In its vast archives are countless references to powers and civilizations long extinguished, many of them contradictory, many more obscured by the deliberate silences imposed by the Inquisition. Among these ancient names one stands apart, the Old Ones. To the Administratum, they are a subject of chronic frustration, for almost no surviving record bears reliable witness to their deeds. To the Adeptus Mechanicus, they are an obsession, invoked in half-lit data vaults and whispered through canticles as possible precursors of technologies beyond even the most sacred standard template constructs. The Adeptus Administratum, ever the stewards of human history, approach the Old Ones through a lens of cautious mythography. The few scattered records that endure often appear in compilations of xenos history and heretical cosmologies seized during inquisitorial purges. These materials, copied and recopied across millennia, are usually preserved only in redacted fragments. Administratum lexicographers are often forced to work with documents so deteriorated by time and deliberate censorship that they resemble riddles more than histories. In such sources, the Old Ones are described in detached formal terms as an ancient progenitor race of unconfirmed physiognomy, believed to have influenced galactic affairs during the primordial aeons preceding the rise of Terra. The phrasing is always intentionally vague, for the Administratum avoids declaring the existence of such beings as fact without unimpeachable proof. Official records maintain that the origins of the galaxy's sentient races are varied and indeterminate, but some archivists quietly suggest that the consistency of myth across numerous xenos civilizations speaks to more than coincidence. The Adeptus Mechanicus, by contrast, embraces a far more dogmatic view. Where the Administratum favours caution, the Mechanicus favours veneration. In Mechanicus lore, the Old Ones are frequently referred to as the Divine Artificers, a title that elevates them not as mere aliens but as forerunners of all that is sacred in the machine god's design. Within sealed cogitator crypts, Mechanicus Magi catalogue accounts of technologies supposedly wrought by the Old Ones. Planetary-scale terraforming engines, psychic conduits capable of stabilizing or exploiting the Imperium, and genetic architectures so refined that entire species could be engineered to serve singular purposes. The most daring among them even whisper that the Old Ones may have created the warp-spanning Webway itself, a network so far beyond the grasp of human science that even the most advanced Mechanicus explorators can only study its fragments in reverent awe. To both the Administratum and the Mechanicus, the challenge lies in authenticating the evidence. The Administratum insists upon bureaucratic rigour, yet so little survives from those ancient epochs that nearly every record rests upon hearsay. Administratum notaries often cite the peril of legend contamination, the phenomenon by which myths from disparate civilizations slowly converge through cultural exchange, making it nearly impossible to disentangle shared origins from simple narrative blending. Thus, while the Eldar, the Orcs, and even certain reptilian xenos species all speak of progenitors with powers akin to those attributed to the Old Ones, Administratum chroniclers refrain from drawing any definitive conclusions. To do otherwise would risk embedding unverified myth into the Imperium's official history, a mistake they regard as a form of heresy against the truth. The Mechanicus, however, defines truth differently. For them, evidence is not merely physical but spiritual. A fragment of technology impossibly advanced may be sufficient to establish the presence of the Old Ones without the need for corroborating records. If a device can be neither replicated nor understood by the Mechanicus, it is often venerated as a relic of the Old Ones, regardless of whether the artifact's provenance is truly ancient or simply the work of some other lost civilization. In this way, the Mechanicus has built up a corpus of supposed Old One relics, catalogued under designations such as Archaeotech Non-Standard, Origin Disputed. These artifacts include stasis chambers that operate without known power sources, crystalline matrices capable of storing psychic energy, and remnants of architectural designs that appear functionally identical to Eldar structures, yet far older in their crafting. To the Mechanicus, every such discovery is further confirmation that the Old Ones existed, and that they were masters of sciences still beyond human reach. This divergence between the Administratum and Mechanicus has created a subtle but enduring tension. Administratum lexicographers complain that Mechanicus archives are closed to them, accessible only through the most heavily redacted communiques. The Mechanicus, in turn, accuse the Administratum of intellectual cowardice, hiding behind bureaucratic procedure when confronted with the wonders of true ancient knowledge. Occasionally this friction erupts into formal disputes, with Administratum officials attempting to classify certain Mechanicus reports as apocryphal, while the Mechanicus respond with accusations of ignorance or suppression. Such conflicts are usually resolved quietly, lest the higher authorities of the Inquisition take notice and impose their own ruthless interpretation of what knowledge may or may not be preserved. Despite their differences, both institutions agree upon one fact. The Old Ones, if they did exist, exerted a monumental influence upon the galaxy in ages so ancient they are beyond proper record. The Administratum acknowledges this reluctantly, while the Mechanicus embraces it with zeal. The result is a fragmented tapestry of documentation that hints at the Old One's nature, but never reveals it fully. A common refrain in both traditions is that the Old Ones were masters of biogenesis and psychic engineering, arts so profound that they sculpted entire species, perhaps even the ancestors of races known today. The Eldar are the most frequently cited example, for even their own myths attribute their creation to a race of ancient progenitors. Orc culture, crudely expressed through the tales of their shamans, makes similar references, though couched in brutal and simplistic terms. To the Administratum, these myths are data points. To the Mechanicus, they are testimony. Records of specific war machines or constructs attributed to the Old Ones are rare, but scattered Mechanicus texts describe planetary defense grids that appear to operate on principles unknown to Imperial science. One such site, recovered in the Eastern Fringe, featured orbital defense platforms capable of striking with pinpoint precision across interplanetary distances. Though most were inert by the time of rediscovery, their remains suggested a technology so refined it left no trace of wasted energy. Administratum observers cautiously noted the resemblance of these structures to later Eldar orbital defenses, while Mechanicus priests claimed them as clear evidence of Old One origin. In the absence of functional machinery, however, both sides are forced to admit that proof is elusive. The ethical character of the Old Ones as interpreted by these bodies is equally contested. Administratum records present them as pragmatic manipulators of biology and culture, motivated by survival in an era of galactic warfare. Mechanicus traditions, meanwhile, ascribe to them an almost divine benevolence, portraying them as architects of order against the encroaching chaos of the war in heaven. Whether these impressions reflect truth or simply the biases of the recorders is impossible to determine. The Administratum recognizes its own tendency toward reductionism, while the Mechanicus openly embraces its theological lens. Both institutions, however, admit that the Old Ones were not immortal. Their legacy, while vast, is fragmentary. If they truly did command the galaxy once, their downfall must have been as cataclysmic as their rise was transformative. The earliest mention of the Old Ones within reconstructed Imperial data appears in relation to the great galactic upheavals of the War in Heaven. The Adeptus Administratum's archivists and the tech priests of the Adeptus Mechanicus have attempted, in fragmented efforts, to catalogue not only the strategic progression of this conflict, but also its logistical and material implications. The very idea of translating a conflict between beings of such antiquity into the ledgers and tabulations familiar to Imperial record-keeping is fraught with difficulty. Yet certain patterns can be discerned from cross-examined xenological accounts, Necron inscriptions, and translated myths among younger species. The Old Ones are understood to have been the dominant power at the opening of the War in Heaven. Their holdings stretched across countless systems, and their client species included a wide variety of psychically capable beings deployed as auxiliaries, vassals, or guardians. When the Necrontyre, bound by their brief and painful lives, sought the power of the C'tan and turned their desperation into conquest, the Old Ones' supremacy came under direct challenge. The resulting conflict is consistently described in Mechanicus reports as not a war in the conventional sense, but as a galactic restructuring. The expenditure of lives, material, and psychic energy is beyond any Imperial category of calculation. Nonetheless, efforts have been made to provide an interpretive framework. The earliest battles, sometimes described as the opening strikes, demonstrated both the scale and the limitations of the Old Ones' methods of war. The Necrontyr fleets, newly empowered by the star gods they called the C'tan, launched vast spearhead campaigns against Old One-controlled systems. The Old Ones themselves rarely appeared directly on these battlefields. Instead, they utilized their vassal races. Among these, the Yorkaero are speculated to have provided technological solutions of extreme adaptability, though the precise role remains uncertain. Other unnamed client species were deployed en masse, bearing weaponry derived from psychic resonance and warp manipulation. Administratum compilers have drawn analogies to Imperial Guard regiments equipped with Mechanicus-grade esoteric armaments, though the comparison is inadequate. Casualty estimates, based on Necron inscriptions and Eldar mytho-histories, suggest that entire species conscripted by the Old Ones were annihilated during these opening phases. The records describe campaigns in which hundreds of worlds were sterilized in a matter of solar cycles. The Administratum has attempted to tabulate losses in the familiar format of planetary compliance reports, but the scale consistently produces absurd calculations, with some archivists marking entire sectors as equivalent to single-unit engagements in the ancient record. It is therefore believed that the Old Ones' approach to manpower was not only vast but flexible. Client races were raised, deployed, and extinguished with a scale of detachment that modern Imperial command structures cannot practically replicate. The middle phase of the War in Heaven is remembered as the period of the C'tan ascendancy. In this stage, the Old Ones began to experience logistical strain. They were forced to spread their assets thin across innumerable fronts. The Necrons, unburdened by mortality or the need for resupply, advanced with relentless efficiency. By contrast, the Old Ones' reliance on living auxiliaries required supply chains, psychic training, and the maintenance of complex societal structures to sustain their war effort. Adeptus Mechanicus reports, when examining this period, highlight the impossibility of sustaining war across such immense distances without faster-than-light methods equal or superior to the Old Ones' own. Their presumed mastery of the Webway is considered the only plausible logistical explanation. From a supply standpoint, the cost of maintaining these campaigns was astronomical. Species bound to the Old Ones were transported across the stars to serve as shock troops. Many of these species are now extinct, leaving only faint archaeological traces. In the context of administratum reporting, the asset expenditures could be compared to the systematic mustering of hundreds of thousands of Astra Militarum regiments, each raised and destroyed in succession without regard to replenishment cycles. That the Old Ones sustained this effort for millennia is considered evidence of a reserve capacity unparalleled in known history. Notable battles often reappear in the mythologies of successor species. One such confrontation is referenced in Elder sagas, describing how the Old Ones' forces use psychic storms to annihilate Necrontyr fleets across entire subsectors. Imperial xenologists interpret these descriptions as evidence of weaponized warp manipulation, projecting psychic energy on such a scale that casualty reports list entire battle fleets lost in seconds. The Necrons, however, responded with Catan-devised nullification strategies. Administratum summaries of translated Necron glyphs suggest that during one campaign alone, 937 Old One allied fleets were erased. No corresponding record of how many Necron forces were destroyed exists, reinforcing the challenge of quantifying cost balance in this war. Another battle consistently noted is the defense of unnamed Webway gates. These engagements are thought to have been central to the Old One's strategy of movement and defense. The Mechanicus emphasized that the loss of Webway nodes corresponded directly to catastrophic collapse in entire sectors of the Old One's influence. One particularly infamous campaign describes the collapse of a nexus that forced allied species to retreat into warp storms. Administratum casualty breakdowns, reconstructed from later Aeldari memory cycles, estimate the annihilation of billions of auxiliaries in a single strategic withdrawal. Such losses, if translated into modern terms, would equal the erasure of multiple segmenta worth of Imperial manpower. The final phase of the War in Heaven is consistently described as the era of entropy, in which the Old One's resources reached critical depletion. They are reported to have attempted the creation of new client species specifically bred for war, among them the Krork. The Mechanicus interprets this as a last-ditch attempt at replenishment, akin to the rapid raising of mass gene-forged regiments under emergency protocols. The Krork, designed to thrive in endless conflict, represented an investment in long-term attrition. From a supply standpoint, the creation of a species capable of sustaining itself without constant logistical support demonstrates a profound adaptation to the costs of war. However, this also suggests that the Old Ones had reached a stage where their traditional methods of supplying war through psychic species and complex hierarchies had failed. Casualty reports of this terminal stage are fragmented but universally apocalyptic. The Administratum notes an almost complete loss of Old One influence. Successor species myths speak of Old Ones hunted to extinction, their client races collapsing in their absence, and the Necrons entombing themselves in triumph. Asset depletion is described in final reports as total, with Administratum scribes often categorizing the end of the War in Heaven as the definitive model of a collapsed logistical structure. Supreme forces unable to replenish their supply lines, consumed by their reliance on auxiliaries, and outlasted by a foe whose immortality required no resupply. The cost of this war, if measured in the terms familiar to the Imperium, is beyond comprehension. The Old Ones expended not only material and personnel, but also the stability of the galaxy itself. Warp storms spread across the stars, disrupting their own supply chains and rendering their Webway mastery less effective. The Necrons and the Catan devoured not only lives, but stars themselves. Administratum tabulators, seeking to place these losses in understandable categories, often conclude that the Old Ones' final expenditure was nothing less than the annihilation of their empire, their client species, and their civilization. This is not simply the collapse of a military force, but the exhaustion of an entire mode of existence. In the aftermath, the records emphasize the dispersal of the surviving client races, the rise of the Aeldari, and the eventual dominance of species shaped by the Old One's interventions. Mechanicus observers note that, paradoxically, the cost of their war ensured the survival of their enemies while simultaneously setting the conditions for younger races to inherit the stars. Thus, the War in Heaven is interpreted as both the pinnacle of expenditure and the foundation of galactic history. The Administratum's final assessment, often repeated in restricted archives, is that the Old One's downfall exemplifies the danger of infinite supply demands. Even entities of godlike mastery could not sustain war indefinitely when facing an enemy that transformed mortality into permanence. The ledger closes not with victory but with extinction, and the casualty line for the Old Ones is marked as absolute. In attempting to consolidate the fragmentary information available on the civilization of the Old Ones, the dual efforts of the Adeptus Administratum and the Adeptus Mechanicus have produced a body of material that, while incomplete, forms the most comprehensive framework of Imperial knowledge regarding these beings. Their findings are constructed from ancient ruins, battlefield remnants, data fragments embedded in xenos archives, and the biological legacies preserved within the many species shaped by Old One intervention. What emerges from this mosaic is not a coherent narrative, but a pattern of recurring themes, technical discoveries, and reluctant conclusions that shape the Imperium's understanding of what may have been the first and most consequential empire the galaxy has ever known. Among the earliest and most consistently noted discoveries are the planetary structures whose origins predate the war in heaven by epochs. These are frequently identified by Mechanicus observers as examples of matter manipulation operating at a scale that cannot be reproduced by modern industry. Monolithic constructs, often spanning kilometers and sometimes entire continents, appear to have been fused directly with the crust of planets, their material composition resistant to atmospheric erosion and even bombardment. Administratum cartographic surveys, cross-referenced with Mechanicus excavation logs, indicate that many such sites are located at geostrategically vital positions, energy nexus points, warp-stable regions, and systems later colonized by younger races such as the Aeldari or Orcs. From this placement, some scribes infer a deliberate attempt by the Old Ones to build nodes of interstellar control, either for scientific observation or as part of a network to stabilize warp corridors. The Mechanicus notes a particular difficulty in classifying these structures. Their material is neither conventional ferrocrete nor any known alloy catalogued in the standard template construct records. Spectral analysis frequently returns contradictory results, with metals, ceramics, and organics blended at levels so fine that no natural or industrial process within Imperial knowledge could have achieved such outcomes. Attempts to extract core samples often result in catastrophic degradation of the material, suggesting that the constructs are bound by energetic fields that collapse upon interference. Magibiologists, when consulted, have compared these properties to the self-regenerative aspects of organic tissue, but on a scale magnified by stellar energy fields. The conclusion most often drawn is that Old One engineering blurred the lines between biology and physics, a merging that remains elusive even to the most radical explorators. The biological discoveries attributed to Old One intervention present perhaps the most enduring evidence of their existence. Administratum compilations highlight the consistency with which numerous xenos species exhibit markers of engineered design. The Krork, later degraded into the Orcs, are the most frequently cited example. Their resilience, self-sustaining fungal biology, and instinctive technological aptitude representing a set of adaptations clearly optimized for galactic warfare. Comparative studies note that the Krork appear to have been designed with self-perpetuation in mind, ensuring that even if their overseers perished, the species would endure as a martial presence indefinitely. In similar measure, the earliest protoforms of the Aeldari are identified as products of genetic uplift, their psychic potency aligning with the Old One's reliance on the Imperium. Fragmentary records from Aeldari myth cycles, collected and cross-referenced by Administratum xenolinguists, confirm this interpretation, describing their creators as ancient beings who sculpted the younger races as instruments and allies against the foes that would emerge during the war in heaven. Other species, less thoroughly studied but still noted in Mechanicus archives, may also bear the imprint of Old One intervention. The Jokero are frequently mentioned, their hyper-adaptive biology and instinctive grasp of technology marking them as potential artifacts of Old One design. The Hrud, with their peculiar entropic auras, are sometimes categorized as byproducts of the Old One's experimentation with temporal or dimensional manipulation. Even humanity itself is occasionally speculated to carry indirect influence, though no conclusive genetic evidence has ever been presented that links mankind to the Old One's laboratories. Such claims are treated with suspicion by the Administratum, though Mechanicus fringe sects continue to probe the matter as part of their broader search for ancestral connections between all intelligent life and the architects of the galaxy. The technological legacy left behind by the Old Ones is perhaps the most confounding area of study. Records from Adeptus Mechanicus survey teams note devices whose function cannot be replicated or even understood within the framework of human science. Examples include gateways that remain functional across millennia, permitting instantaneous travel between distant points of the galaxy, though often only for objects calibrated with specific energetic signatures long since lost. Others consist of stasis fields in which entire ecosystems have been preserved in unaging suspension, defying entropy itself. In one documented case, a Mechanicus team reported an intact planetary vault containing flora and fauna extinct elsewhere in the galaxy, maintained as though frozen in time. Attempts to access the deeper strata of the vault triggered defensive measures that annihilated the expedition, leaving only fragmentary Auspex readings behind. The Administratum, tasked with consolidating these findings into coherent records, faces the challenge of reconciling inconsistent reports and unreliable data. To address this, many scribes frame the Old Ones not as a singular empire, but as a diffuse civilization operating through multiple forms and proxies. Their war against the Necrontyr and their alliance with younger races is interpreted as evidence of both technological dominance and strategic desperation. Reports stress that even at the height of their power, the Old Ones demonstrated a reliance on auxiliaries, implying either a limitation of their numbers or an ideological preference for manipulation over direct expansion. These analyses are not unanimous, but they serve as the most pragmatic framework by which Imperial records describe a force otherwise beyond comprehension. Final analyses offered by the Adeptus Administratum consistently emphasize the cautionary implications of the Old One's history. They are presented as a civilization whose immense mastery of biology, psychic power, and dimensional engineering nonetheless fail to preserve them from destruction. For Administratum scribes, this provides a historical precedent by which to frame imperial policy. Even the greatest powers may fall to hubris, internecine conflict, or the rise of rivals. Their legacy is thus framed not as a model to emulate, but as a reminder of impermanence, a lesson that serves the bureaucratic function of tempering imperial ambition with the memory of extinction. By contrast, the Adeptus Mechanicus treats the Old Ones as both enigma and ideal. The Mechanicus obsession with standard template constructs and lost technologies finds in the Old Ones a source of mythic inspiration, one that may justify continued exploration and the risking of lives and resources in pursuit of rediscovery. In the most radical interpretations, the Old Ones are imagined as proto-omniscient figures, precursors to the machine god whose merging of flesh and machine represented the apotheosis of knowledge. These interpretations are controversial and rarely allowed beyond Mechanicus circles, for they risk contravening the theological strictures of the cult Mechanicus. Nonetheless, they persist in private, encoded discussions, where Magi debate whether the Old Ones represent the lost apex of biological machine synthesis, and whether rediscovery of their works would herald humanity's ascension or its annihilation. Together, these dual perspectives, Administratum caution and Mechanicus reverence, define the Imperium's final analysis of the Old Ones. They are recognized as an extinct or near-extinct civilization whose actions shaped the galaxy's evolutionary and cultural foundation. They are credited with seeding the warp-sensitive races that would later rise to prominence, with constructing technological artifacts that still defy replication, and with waging wars whose consequences echo through the millennia. Yet their fate remains obscure, their downfall leaving behind only scattered ruins and genetic footprints. Whether they perished entirely or exist in diminished hidden forms is unknown, and within the bounds of Imperial doctrine perhaps unknowable. What is certain, in the conclusions of both Administratum and Mechanicus records, is that the Old Ones remain central to the galaxy's design. Every species that traces its origins to their manipulation, every ruin that hints at their vanished empire, every battlefield scar still visible on worlds reshaped by their wars, testifies to a civilization that, though long absent, continues to dictate the conditions of galactic life. The Imperium, for all its vast dominion, exists within a framework not of its own making, but one first established by these ancient precursors. To study the Old Ones, then, is not merely to engage in archaeological curiosity, but to confront the truth that humanity remains a latecomer in a galaxy built by others. Their discoveries, incomplete though they are, remind the Imperium that its history is only the latest chapter in a far older and far more complex narrative, one authored by beings whose vision and power remain unmatched. The Inquisition approaches the subject of the Old Ones with the same guarded severity it applies to every matter deemed a potential existential threat to the Imperium. Within sealed libraria across the segmentum solar, classified under designations ranging from Ordo Xenos file crypts to Ordo Malleus, secured reliquaries, exist scattered fragments of analysis, recovered testimonies, and partial translations of long-forgotten data caches that reference the Old Ones. These records are not stored together. Instead, they are deliberately fragmented across multiple archives to limit the possibility of any one individual assembling a coherent narrative. To the Ordo Xenos, the Old Ones represent an unresolved evolutionary mystery, entities whose mastery of genetic engineering and species-guided uplift had no equal, save perhaps the Necron-Cryptek dynasties in their prime. The Inquisition's documents describe them as a potential template species, one that, were they ever to resurface, could alter the balance of power in the galaxy by repeating their process of designing client races. Marginalia in certain files propose that the Aeldari and Krork were deliberate Old One creations, with the implication that other xenos, perhaps even some strains of humanity, bear indirect traces of manipulation. These suggestions are never elevated to canon within inquisitorial discourse, but the presence of such annotations demonstrates the quiet unease within the Ordo Xenos about the Old One's true reach. The Ordo Malleus views them through a darker lens. Though no credible evidence suggests that the Old Ones trafficked with the ruinous powers, the Malleus maintains files positing that their reliance upon the warp as a conduit for psychic warfare and interspecies communication may have been the single greatest accelerant for the warp's destabilization during the War in Heaven. In this view, the Old Ones were not willing allies of chaos, but unwitting contributors to the corruption of the Imperium. Records point to the proliferation of psychic weaponry, the deliberate cultivation of psychic traits within servant species, and the construction of Webway networks as acts that permanently changed the warp ecosystem. The Malleus therefore catalogues the Old Ones not only as a historical people, but as one of the primal catalysts for the immaterial threat the Imperium faces daily. In rare instances, sealed reports from radical inquisitors suggest that fragments of Old One technology may have survived into the present era. These claims are almost always accompanied by suppression orders. Inquisitor Kaelorn of the Ordo Xenos, for example, filed a record during the 32nd millennium alleging the discovery of a vault world containing constructs resembling the biogenetic laboratories described in Aeldari myth. The report was sequestered, Kaelorn declared extremis diabolus, and subsequent searches yielded nothing, either through deliberate redaction or destruction. Such cases are not isolated. Dozens of inquisitors, over the span of 10 millennia, have independently claimed encounters with material that could be traced to the Old Ones, only to have their testimonies reclassified, erased, or sealed. The tone of official inquisitorial records is cautious to the point of sterility. Where Mechanicus entries describe technology and Administratum files attempt to tabulate impact, the Inquisition writes in terms of contamination, risk, and suppression. No record is permitted to circulate without first being evaluated for its potential to undermine the Imperium's carefully maintained orthodoxy. The result is an archive that does not educate but warns. To read inquisitorial records of the Old Ones is not to study them in detail, but to be reminded that even knowledge of their existence carries danger. Yet between the margins, contradictions emerge. Certain inquisitorial factions quietly advance the idea that the Old Ones were not merely one among many ancient species, but perhaps the keystone upon which the galactic biosphere was constructed. Others argue that this narrative is itself a dangerous myth, invented by alien storytellers and preserved by unreliable Aeldari records. The official position of the Conclave remains one of studied ambiguity. The Old Ones are acknowledged in restricted archives, their influence referenced in whispers, but no sanctioned conclave has ever declared their existence a matter of verified fact. Thus, the Inquisition preserves the paradox: a civilization too important to erase, yet too dangerous to describe in detail. In their treatment of the Old Ones lies the essence of inquisitorial philosophy, knowledge withheld not out of ignorance, but out of fear of what that knowledge might invite. The sealed vaults of the Ordo Xenos contain records that the wider Imperium has never been permitted to study, files whose very headings are masked beneath multiple layers of clearance. Within these documents lie scattered references to conflicts whose outcomes defy conventional explanation. Though the Old Ones are never explicitly named, the circumstances point back to their lingering touch, or to remnant forces shaped by their ancient hand. The Inquisition does not speak of them openly, yet the repeated pattern of suppression is itself a form of confirmation. The first of these accounts appears under the designation Excidium Anomaly 94, linked to the distant halo stars bordering Segmentum Pacificus. A crusading fleet was dispatched to pacify a Xenos enclave, whose ships bore crystalline hulls and displayed weaponry unseen in the wider galaxy. Reports suggest that the Imperial fleet achieved swift dominance, only to encounter sudden collapse in its own chain of command. Admirals, captains, and even inquisitorial agents turned on one another with inexplicable fury, as if driven to fratricide by an unseen hand. Surviving vox logs record words in no human tongue echoing through the bridge chambers before system-wide silence descended. The incident was declared a void anomaly, and all material evidence was destroyed. Yet the correlation with earlier Mechanicus notes on mind alteration linked to the Old Ones is difficult to dismiss. Another redacted event, archived under the title The Lixian Purge, describes an Imperial Guard campaign against a primitive reptilian species. At first glance, the action seemed routine, a show of Imperial might against a minor civilization. But after the compliance was supposedly completed, entire regiments were withdrawn with unusually high levels of attrition unrelated to combat. Administratum audit revealed missing material on a scale unprecedented for a minor operation. Hundreds of armoured vehicles unaccounted for, void ships listed as lost with no record of combat, and command staff replaced without public reason. Among the notes of an attending inquisitor, one phrase is repeated: "Their masters walk unseen." No further explanation survives in unredacted form. There are also the mysterious conflicts surrounding the Orphean region, prior to the Necron awakening chronicled millennia later. Imperial colonization efforts repeatedly faltered, despite the worlds appearing resource-rich and uninhabited. Each attempt met with sabotage, unexplained natural disasters, and sudden mass hysteria among settlers. One report, buried in an Ordo Xenos vault, describes a brief sighting of vast reptilian beings moving through atmospheric storms, seemingly composed of light and matter interwoven. The event was dismissed officially as hallucinatory exposure to warp energies, yet the file itself carries the sub-designation Relicti Vetustissimi, an archaic, High Gothic phrase meaning remnants of the old. These are not isolated fragments. Across thousands of years, similar encounters surface, always carefully classified as anomalous, unverified, or non-repeatable phenomena. Yet the pattern is consistent: unexplained battlefield fratricide, missing war material, psychic disturbances that erase the will to fight, and fleeting sightings of entities who do not match any known alien template. Even where the Inquisition itself refuses to name them, the shadow of the Old Ones lingers. What is most striking is not the records themselves, but the silence around them. Reports are sealed not because they lack evidence, but because they risk connecting the present to a prehistoric epoch the Imperium cannot control. The suppression of these battles is not simply to hide defeat. It is to prevent recognition that the Old Ones, in some diminished or distorted form, may still exert influence over a galaxy that believes them long vanished. The archives of the Holy Ordos contain more silence than revelation when it comes to the Old Ones. That silence, however, is instructive. It is structured, deliberate, and enforced by ritualized processes designed to bury, rather than illuminate, what little has been uncovered. The Inquisition's relationship with this ancient progenitor race is marked not by continuity of study, but by intermittent discoveries followed swiftly by erasures. Each instance is catalogued less as inquiry and more as damage control, often classed alongside xenos extermination reports and warp quarantine protocols. Within inquisitorial procedure, the Old Ones occupy a unique doctrinal category. Unlike the Necrons, whose existence has been firmly established and classified as a species of mechanical xenos, or the Aeldari, whose myths are begrudgingly recorded as cultural artifacts, the Old Ones are almost always recorded in the subjunctive. Documents rarely state that they were, but that they may have been. Where Administratum and Mechanicus reports suggest the presence of advanced technology, anomalous biology, or impossible constructs, the Ordos Malleus and Xenos reframe the evidence as precursor distortions. The phrasing reduces certainty, offering a protective ambiguity that prevents dangerous knowledge from solidifying into fact. This practice has ritualized forms. When an Inquisitor encounters material suspected to be linked to the Old Ones, the act of record is paired with the act of containment. The initial account is redacted, duplicated, and sealed under multiple authorization codes. A parallel record, often diluted to the point of irrelevance, is deposited in the Ordo's secondary archives to serve as the official version. The result is a deliberate bifurcation of history, the complete version, sealed in silence, and the partial one, left accessible but useless to future scholars. The doctrinal debates surrounding the Old Ones are equally structured, though they rarely emerge into formal conclaves. Inquisitors who permit themselves to speculate on the role of the Old Ones in the shaping of the galaxy are often censured by peers, not because their arguments lack foundation, but because any suggestion of order behind the chaos of the current age threatens imperial orthodoxy. If it is admitted that the galaxy was once designed, seeded with potential and cultivated toward specific ends, then the claim that the Imperium is a divine inevitability is weakened. Inquisitorial dogma cannot tolerate such undermining narratives. Thus, debate over the Old Ones is less about evidence and more about theology disguised as security. The Ordo Xenos has, on rare occasions, debated whether the Old Ones should be categorized as a race or as a force. Certain sealed transcripts reveal that some Inquisitors reject the notion of them as biological beings altogether, proposing instead that they were a category of warp manipulative entities straddling the line between material existence and psychic projection. Others argue that such speculation is indistinguishable from heretical demonology, further justifying suppression. The ultimate resolution, time and again, is the enforcement of silence rather than the pursuit of consensus. The rituals of final censure regarding the Old Ones resemble those used for demon cult suppression. Sites believed to contain their remnants, architectural, genetic, or technological, are subject to erasure protocols that exceed mere military destruction. Cleansing is accompanied by archivistic excision. Local populations are exterminated or mind-wiped through sanctioned psycho-intervention. Even planetary records are rewritten, planetary names altered, so that within a generation the site ceases to exist in collective knowledge. These actions in themselves form one of the most consistent records of the Old Ones. Wherever their presence may once have been, there follows an orchestrated silence. Behavioral instincts of the Inquisition toward the Old Ones reveal more about Imperial psychology than about the Xenos themselves. Unlike other species, the Old Ones provoke a reflex not of curiosity or extermination, but of concealment. It is a defensive instinct, shaped by the fear that acknowledgement of such a race undermines human centrality in the cosmic order. This instinct manifests not only in silences and censures, but also in symbolic rites, such as the burning of incomplete codices, the oath-binding of acolytes to maintain ignorance, and the strategic misclassification of precursor ruins as Necrontyr anomalies, or Aeldari relics. In the end, the Inquisition's records on the Old Ones function less as an archive of fact than as a monument to control. They preserve by erasing, record by misdirecting, and interpret by silencing. What fragments remain, scattered testimonies, disjointed battle reports, and heavily redacted Mechanicus transmissions, stand as much as warnings against curiosity as they do as evidence of an ancient race. For the Inquisition, the Old Ones are not a mystery to be solved, but a threat to be indefinitely delayed, held at bay by ritualized ignorance and institutionalized silence.